away we go.
Hello and welcome to Murder and Witches in the Cambridge Festival. This event is being hosted by Anglia Ruskin University, and for those of you who don't know who we are the other university in Cambridge, located in Cambridge's East End. Now, before I introduce our panel, I'd like to thank you for making the journey here today. We've been overwhelmed by the response to this event and are so grateful for your interest. We're going to start by each giving a 15-minute talk about some of the history behind our crime novels, and this will be followed by half an hour for questions. So please do ask us anything you want to about the history we're going to talk about our books or the writing process. And you can post your questions in the Q&A box at the side of the screen. And at the end of the talks, our moderator is going to release the questions and we'll do our best to answer as many of them as we can. Finally, as part of this event, signed copies of our books are available to be purchased from an independent bookshop in Nottingham called The Bookcase. And we're going to be putting up a link during this session at various points, but you can find them at thebookcase.co.uk. And if you click on there and wait about a minute, you'll get a screen coming up where you can select the this Cambridge Festival event there. And there's also a 3-for-2 deal available on those books. Now, we're very lucky to have two wonderful guests for this event today. So let me introduce first Cathi Unsworth, who's published 6 crime novels, 2 of which are set in World War II. One of those, That Old Black Magic, concerns the Hagley Woods mystery, which is what she's going to be talking about today. As well as being a novelist, Cathi has appeared many times on TV and radio, including in BBC Two's The Culture Show, and she's also written for Sounds, which is the music paper I first started to read when I was a teenager, The Guardian, 14 Times, Melody Maker, among others. Now, if I could just hand over to Cathi briefly and ask if you could tell us briefly about your last book, your most recent book, Cathi.
Well, my most recent book is a republished book that I wrote 14 years ago called Bad Penny Blues that has just come back out from Stranger Tractor Press, and it's another true story. It's the first time I tried to recreate a true crime in a fictional form, and it's the unsolved Thames towpath murders from 1959 to 1965, which happened in my neighbourhood of Ladbroke Grove, and that was my first published séance.
Excellent. Well, that sounds fascinating. Thanks, Cathi. We'll come back to you in just a minute for your talk. But the second panel member is Syd Moore, who's published 8 mystery thrillers, 6 of which comprise the Essex Witch Museum series, as well as a collection of short stories. And her writing is inspired by the myths and history of Essex, and Syd is an expert in the history of witches. She's also a campaigner and for 4 years presented the Channel 4 literary programme Pulp. So Syd, can I just ask you to briefly introduce your latest book for us? Okay, well, I don't know where Syd's gone, but we will definitely come back to Syd later. I think what we'll do, as we're waiting for Syd to come back, is we'll go to the first talk, which is from Cathi. So are you okay to start us off, Cathi?
Yes, I'm very much okay. Are we queued up with the slides and everything? Shall I just begin? So this is the story behind Bella and the Witch Elm mystery, which is at the core of that old black magic. And hopefully, as I start to talk, you can see the Hagley Hall estate, the ancestral home of Viscount Cobham, which lies on the Worcestershire borders near Stourbridge, nestled in the Clent Hills. It was landscaped in the mid-18th century by George Littleton, advised by his friend the Gothic novelist Horace Walpole. Littleton's designs were drawn up by a local architect, Sanderson Miller, who dotted the estate with follies fashioned from a local red sandstone. A Doric temple here, a ruined castle there, and, marking the highest point of the land, the summit of Witchbury Hill, an 84-foot obelisk. Next slide, please. On completion, Hagley Hall's grounds were considered the most beautiful in all England. But it's not for this that they have achieved their legend. Instead, it's for a deed carried out in the blackout of the Second World War amid the carnage of the Birmingham Blitz, then not uncovered for 18 months until a bunch of schoolboys went foraging in Hagley Woods in the April of 1943. The grim discovery they made and the mysterious sequence of events that followed on from their find have all the hallmarks of a fairy tale. Can you skip 2 slides now, please, to that one? Yes. Teenagers Robert Hart, that's him, Thomas Willis, Bob Farmer and Fred Payne had been playing football on the Sunday of 18th of April when they decided to take the walk to the woods. Local paranormal researcher Jane Harris, who's made a film about the case, found a local man, Tom Hart, no relation to Robert, who was in the game of football. Tom told Jane he had a bad feeling about going to the woods, which is why he didn't join his friends. But it was a warm and sunny day. The bluebells were out as they walked into the stretch of woodland. The cry of a bird drew them towards a tree known locally as the Witch Elm. Next slide, please, because of its creepy appearance. The then 15-year-old farmer moved towards it. He caught a glint of white amongst the foliage and thought he'd found a bird's nest. But as he closed in, he saw the empty eye sockets of a skull staring back up at him from the hollow in the trunk. Next slide, please. At first, he thought it belonged to an animal, but as he lifted it out, he saw a small patch of skin from which a few strands of hair protruded. A jawbone with prominent front teeth, the front left incisor crossed over the right, completed the realization that what he held in his hands had once been a human head. Terrified by what they discovered, and the fact that they might be caught by the gamekeeper and punished for trespassing or worse, the lads agreed to put it back and tell no one what they'd seen. This resolve lasted only until bedtime for the youngest of their number, 13-year-old Tommy Willits. Unable to face the terrors of the night, he confessed to his parents, who alerted the Worcestershire County Police. The next morning, Superintendent Holyhead and Detective Inspector Williams of the Worcestershire Force met at the site with Detective Superintendent Richardson from Birmingham and Professor James Webster, Head of Forensic Medicine and Toxicology from Birmingham University. Inside the hollow tree, next slide please, they found the remains of a woman, a crepe-soled shoe and decomposed clothing. The skeleton was incomplete. A further search uncovered more bones, including her right hand buried nearby, and 100 yards away, a shoe matching the one in the tree. Professor Webster took the remains back to his lab. Following publication of his findings, the coroner's inquest at Stourbridge on the 28th of April returned a verdict of murder by some person or persons unknown. 5 days later, Professor Webster elucidated his findings at the first regional police conference since the exhumation. What they had discovered, he said, was the body of a woman about 35, 5 foot tall with distinctive teeth. He estimated she'd been in the tree between 18 months to 3 years. I can't imagine accidentally slipping in there, he opined. It was an excellent place for the concealment of a murder, and I think it indicates local knowledge. Police reports circulated advice to investigating officers that the district where the skeleton was found was visited nightly by a large number of people from Birmingham, West Bromwich and Smethwick about 18 months to 2 years ago during enemy raids on those districts. The district is also much frequented by pleasure-seeking couples. A nationwide search followed, with police first checking 3,000 missing persons files. Professor Webster drew up a detailed picture of the woman, next slide please, and what she'd been wearing. A fawn-coloured slip she might have hurriedly thrown her clothes over during an air raid, a portion of which was the same material he had found lodged in her throat, causing her death by asphyxiation. A striped cardigan in navy and mustard, and a mustard wool skirt. There was no coat, indicating the victim took her last walk in the woods in the summer. Her black size 5.5 crepe-soled shoes came from a batch traced by detectives to a market in Dudley. Photographs of her teeth were also widely circulated and published in medical journals. Despite their distinctive appearance, these elicited no response. The only leads these bulletins garnered was the re-examination of a report made by a local businessman who had heard screams coming from Hagley Woods one night in July 1941. Police were summoned but found nothing at the time. It seemed that nobody knew who the dead woman was, until a message was received in the night just before the Christmas of 1943. It was written in chalk in capital letters 3 inches deep on the side of a house in Old Hill, a 15-minute walk from Hagley Road. Who put Bella down the witch elm? Next slide, it read. A few days later, another graffito in the same hand appeared in Birmingham, followed by 2 more in the fruit market, stating Hagley Wood Bella. Picking up on the link to the skeleton in the woods, local press asked in return, "Do you know Bella?" Next slide, please. No one replied. But the skeleton in the tree now had a name that everyone started using. And the tracks refused to go away. Similar markings appeared on a 5-bar gate in Hales Owen, next slide please, and on a wall in Wolverhampton in August 1944. Both read, Hagley Woods Bella was opposite Rose and Crown, Hasbury. Hasbury is a village close to where the initial message appeared. This appeared to be the work of the same person, yet police could find no trace of anyone who went by this name. Then another voice chipped into the deepening mystery and cast the murder in still darker a hue. Professor Margaret Murray, next slide please, had an academic career few women of her generation could rival. She had assisted the Egyptologist Flinders Petrie on historic digs in Abydos and Petra, pioneering archaeological work for which she received an honorary doctorate from UCL in 1931. Murray developed a concurrent interest in folklore, on which she published 2 influential books, The Witch Cult in Western Europe, 1921, and The God of Witches, 1933. Murray weighed into the Bella debate by drawing attention to the missing right hand. This detail signified to her that the murder bore the hallmarks of a ritual. A hand of glory, next slide please, was a totem taken from the corpse of a murderer. Wrapped in black cloth with herbs and buried close to the body, it was supposed to stop its evil spirit from wandering. According to Murray, it was an arcane tradition to imprison the spirit of a witch by putting her inside a hollow tree, adding to the potency of the murder setting and areas links to the ancient world. Witchbury Hill is also the site of Witchbury Ring, an Iron Age hill fort. Next slide, please. Although the name is actually unrelated, being derived from the Saxon Mercian sub-kingdom of Quick. This theory seized the public's imagination and haunts the case to this day. However, Professor Webster's original report attached no importance to the missing hand. He merely stated that, in such cases, you have depredations caused not only by the weather, but by vermin. In other words, he thought an animal had carried it away. Margaret Murray, though, would have further cause to warn of black magic being practiced in the Black Country. 2 years later, on Valentine's Day 1945, 74-year-old hedger and ditcher Charles Walton from the Warwickshire village of Lower Quinton was found murdered by the tools of his trade, pinned to the ground with his pitchfork, his trouncing hook in his guts. Like Bella, Walton was found on a site loaded with significance, the Iron Age hill fort Meon Hill, where the devil once appeared and ghostly hounds repeatedly still roam. Despite drafting in the skills of Chief Inspector Fabian of the Yard, next slide please, this case was never solved either. It would be twinned with the Hagley Woods again in Donald McCormick's sensational 1968 book Murder by Witchcraft. A decade passed without further developments until in 1953, the Wolverhampton Express and Star columnist Lieutenant Colonel Wilfred Byford Jones received a letter. Under the name Quester, he'd been running a series of atmospheric articles about the unsolved murder. Next slide, please. Returning to Hagley Woods at night on the 10th anniversary of the crime. Quester's articles ran with a picture of the tree, which, though terrifying in appearance, is not the same one in police files. Next slide, please. In response, he drew a sleeping source out of the shadows. "Finish your articles, read the Witch Elm by all means," his correspondent began. "They're interesting to your readers, but you'll never solve the mystery. The one person who could give you an answer is now beyond the jurisdiction of earthly courts. The affair is closed and involves no witches, black magic, or moonlight rites. The only clues I can give you are that the person responsible for the crime died insane in 1942, and the victim was Dutch and arrived illegally in England in 1941. I have no wish to recall any more." She signed herself Anna from Claverley. Byford Jones passed the letter on to Worcestershire CID and met with the mysterious Anna on the 5th of December 54 at the Dick Whittington Inn, Kinniver. She turned out to be Una Mossop, whose husband Jack, a former RAF pilot, was working as an engineer at the Standard Aero Works when he sold information to a Dutchman called Van Raalte, a spy working as a trapeze artist at the Birmingham Hippodrome, who was helping to orchestrate the Birmingham Blitz. Bella, she said, was another enemy agent, murdered by Van Raalte and Hagley Woods in the back of Jack Mossop's car. After helping the Dutchman hide her body, Una's husband was driven mad by the deed and died in an asylum in 1942. Could the screams reported by the businessman in July 1941 have been this murder taking place? Quester wrote that MI5 had been brought in to verify the details. Acting on Mossop's information, police sought a Dutch woman called Laura Van Raalte, who had been working as a schoolteacher in Great Malvern in 1940, when she was alleged to have been teaching her pupils to sing the German national anthem. Dismissed from her post, she'd not been heard of since. However, this possible Bella was found to be alive and well in Nottingham in 1954. In the aforementioned Murder by Witchcraft, Donald McCormick claims a woman named Clarabella, dropped by a parachute into the Midlands in 1941, was the wife of Dutch spy Johannes Marius Dronkers, who was caught and executed in 1942. The fact that parachute harnesses were recovered from Hagley Woods during the war lends credence to this, though Dronkers addressed his wife Elizabeth when he wrote his final letter home. Nothing concrete seems to have come from Quester's informant, but the fact he mentions MI5 is tantalising, because subsequently Bella's remains disappeared from where they had been stored at the Birmingham Medical School. Was she spirited away by spooks after all? 6 years ago, a declassified MI5 file was released to the National Archives. It detailed the interrogation of a German agent named Joseph Jacobs. Next slide, please. Arrested after breaking his ankle as he was parachuted into the fens near Peterborough in January 1941. Jacobs had been supplied with fake ID, a long-wave radio, a map and over £400 in cash. In the lining of his suit was a photograph of a glamorous woman with a message written on the back in English and signed, "You're Clara." Jacobs told his interrogators she was his lover, the actress and singer Clara Barral, next slide please, who had connections to high-ranking Nazis and worked as a secret agent. She'd spent 2 years in the music halls of the West Midlands before the war and spoke English with a Brummie accent. Clara recruited Jacobs to join her in a life of espionage. He was supposed to make radio contact with her as soon as he landed, but instead he was surrounded by farmers and captured. Jacobs, who was in frail physical and mental health during his interrogation, was not considered to be of use to British intelligence, and so became the last man ever to be executed in the Tower of London, dispatched by firing squad at 7:12 a.m. on the 15th of August 41. Reporting this story in March 2013, Alison Vale in The Independent joined some dots between Clara Barrell, McCormick's Clara Bella, and the showbiz connection of Quester's Anna, with the closing revelation that all traces of Clara Barrell's existence ran out after the spring of 41. It was the most dramatic twist in the Bella tale yet. And yet. Professor Webster's autopsy clearly states the woman in the tree was 5 feet tall. Clara Barrell was almost 6 foot. Though her trail of recordings and film appearances does dry up in 41, Jacob's granddaughter Giselle has a death certificate stating that she died in December 1942 in Berlin. None of this has laid Bella to rest. Though a report in Birmingham Gazette from 53 quotes Detective Superintendent Tom Williams stating he had tracked down the author of the original Bella graffiti and dismissed him as a crank, the writing keeps reappearing. 40 years on, the question who put Bella in the witch elm was posed again on a car park wall in Hagley in August 84 and dismissed by West Mercia police as a prank. 50 years on, Bob Farmer and Bob Hart returned to the woods to recall that fateful day for local TV news item Crime Stalker. Farmer's recollection had changed over time, as had the location of the reconstruction, filmed at Witchbury Ring, some distance from the original tree, which has long since been felled. On the morning of 18th August 1999, the sun rose over Witchbury Hill to reveal the same message written across the obelisk. Next slide, please. When I visited the site in October 2016, it remained, and signs begging the same information had been hung about Hagley Woods, close to where the original witch elm was said to have been. Next slide, please. Bella's story has given inspiration to musicians, artists, poets, filmmakers, and writers down the years, since the witch elm gave up one secret only to spawn legion more. And perhaps the only conclusion that can ever be drawn from the entire mystery is that it is one destined never to be solved. And I would just like to add 2 postscripts to this talk. Jane Harris was recently contacted by a travelling family and told a story about a Lou Bella who was murdered in Hagley Woods. A promising lead, but largely thanks to the pandemic, she has yet been able to verify the story. Jane has spoken to a lot of locals about this case, looking for possible solutions. She even had somebody recreate the crime scene in cake. And next slide, please. Although referenced in all articles and books I could find about the case, the source article from which Margaret Murray's claims were first published remains a mystery. It's usually cited as being published in a local paper. I consulted Professor Ronald Hutton, the country's leading expert on witchcraft, and he said despite his own exhaustive research into local newspaper archives, he'd never been able to trace this article. But maybe there's somebody listening in today who could elucidate. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Cathi. Well, I'm going to be watching this Q&A chat very closely to see if somebody else is going to respond to your challenge there. But it's a fantastic book, that Old Black Magic, that Cathy's written about this. So do, you know, if you haven't read it, get it, read it, and you'll really enjoy it, I guarantee. Now, the next person who's going to talk is Syd, and I've given a brief introduction to Syd, but didn't have a chance to ask her to tell us very briefly about her latest book. So if you're there, Syd, do you want to give us a quick description of your book?
Yes, hi Mick, I am here. Hi. Well, my latest book, which is coming out in June, it was meant to come out last June, but it's coming out this June, is it's actually, I think it's the 5th or the 6th in the Essex Witch Museum series, and the Essex Witch Museum is run by 2 characters called Rosie Strange and Sam Stone, and this book actually looks into Sam's backstory, and it's about near-death syndrome and abductions, there you go. That's quite interesting, isn't it?
That is interesting.
But shall I start? Because I could just start talking about how I came up with the Essex Witch Museum idea and everything.
Yeah, we've only got 15 minutes for you, Syd. And we're desperate to hear, although we'd love to hear about that, we're all actually really desperate to hear about the history of witches at this moment.
Okay.
And I've noticed there's a few people asking questions about your books in the chat, so we'll get back to that after the talk. So yeah, over to you.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. Sorry, Chris, are you just doing this or am I doing it? I can't tell. I think you're doing it. So this is I think what you've got on your screens at the moment is my first book, which is called The Drowning Pool, and this was about a sea witch who lived in Leigh-on-Sea, where I live, and I found out about her when the pub opened. You can see a little shot of the pub there. The pub opened that was named after her. Next slide, please. But it wasn't this. It was while I was doing the research for Sarah Moore that I actually stumbled across the statistic, which really shocked me, which was about Essex. I'm just checking that you've got it up. Yeah, okay. So as you can see, I googled Essex witches, and of course I didn't find anything about Sarah Moore. I found out this statistic, which really shocked me, and that is between 1560 to 1680 in Hertford, Surrey and Sussex, there was a total of 185 recorded indictments for witchcraft. For the same period, Essex on its own recorded 503. So I was really quite staggered by that, because of course I'd heard about Salem. I'd also heard about Pendle. Pendle, I think there were 12 souls who lost their life, and Salem 19 over 19 months. But as I looked into Essex, I found out that on just one day in 1645, 19 women were put to death. And this was largely due to the efforts of, if you can have next slide, please, thank you, Matthew Hopkins, which a lot of people are aware of him. And I looked into his witch hunt, which lasted from 1645 to 1647 in that book, Witch Hunt. And one of the things that I did at this time was I was really amazed that we'd had so many witch hysterias, really. So I went to my local council, who were thinking about creating a museum, and I just said to them, can we do something about all the lives lost to the witch hunts? So they told me to go out and to look for artifacts, see if there were things that were available that could be used in an exhibition. So I did that, and I discovered that they were. So then it was suggested that I apply to the Arts Council for a grant to do some research and development to see if this was good to go, and unfortunately that got declined due to lack of interest. So being rather pig-headed, I kind of thought, you know what, I've got all of these artifacts in my head, I know what I'm doing, I'm going to create my own exhibition. And so next slide, please. I created a fictional witch museum called the Essex Witch Museum, and I kind of used this as a vehicle through which to explore a lot of the stories about the women who've been persecuted for witchcraft in our county. Next slide, please. The first book in the series, Strange Magic, looks at the case of Ursula Kemp. Ursula was a healer and a midwife, and went about her business perfectly well until a baby that she hadn't delivered, but a baby, she knew the mother, fell out of cot and broke her neck, and then the finger of blame uncurled and pointed towards Ursula. She was sent off to, she was examined by the local magistrate, and then next slide please, was then imprisoned in the cage in St Osyth, and actually next slide please. This is still there. You can see it sort of built into the bottom of that house. Well, someone's built a house on top of it. And I think it's for sale if anyone fancies it. Most haunted have been there as well. But alas, Ursula was not released. The magistrate at the time told her if she convinced him that she was a witch, then she'd go free. So she did. She absolutely sang like a canary, and unfortunately she wasn't let free. She was sent off to Colchester Castle. Next slide, please. And this is where all of the witches in Essex, once they had been subjected to the witch tests and were sort of didn't pass those, were found guilty of witchcraft through these tests, they were then sent off to this particular jail in the dungeon of Colchester Castle, where they were then kept until they were sent to usually the Chelmsford Assizes and tried there. Ursula was sent to the Assizes along with, I can't remember how many it was in that case, but a lot. And she was found guilty along with another woman, Elizabeth Bennet. And according to one source, after she was hanged, executed, because she was seen as being the main culprit, to make an example of her, allegedly, her body was stripped naked and then dunked in tar and then left to harden on the gallows for 29 days and 29 nights, whereafter it was taken back to St Osoph and allegedly hung at the crossroads there. Now, that's where you might think this story ends, but next slide, please. In 1921, a gentleman in St Osoph was excavating his garden. He was just going to extend his kitchen, and he came across this, which is clearly a skeleton, but obviously it was buried on unconsecrated ground. And it was not only that, it was buried in a north-south direction. Christian burials are usually east-west, so Christians will rise up to greet the Messiah in the second coming, but this obviously was north-south. It was on unconsecrated grounds, and it was also, another striking thing was there was iron in, I think you can just see it, there's iron in the calves and in the wrists, keeping the skeleton pinned into the ground, and this was a very common witch practice. So again, allegedly, one source, which was Cecil Williamson, says that Charlie Brooker, who was the man who found it, there were archaeologists at the local abbey, and they came and they said, oh, it's a female. Yes, I imagine this must be Ursula Kemp. So what did Charlie Brooker do? He put a sheet of glass over the top and charged people to come and have a look at it. Next slide, please. And there they are, all having a look at the Wicked Witch of the East. And in fact, it became a very, very popular destination. Next slide, please. And there they are. People used to come from all abouts, from the East End and from South End to St Osoph to have a look at the Wicked Witch of the West. Chris, can you skip the next slide? This is actually a piece of footage of Cecil Williamson digging up the skeleton later. But what happened was all of this sort of ended during the Second World War, and afterwards Charlie Brooker's son-in-law wanted to exhibit the skeleton again, but he was not allowed because we invented health and safety and town planning. So he decided to, I think, sell it or give it up. And Cecil Williamson, who was the founder of the Museum of Witchcraft and Magic in Boscastle, came along and he dug it up, and he took her the Museum of Witchcraft and Magic in Boscastle. And you'd think that that's where the story ends, but it doesn't. And I'm not going to tell you any more about that, other than to say that there is, I don't know if you can see me on screen, but there is, I have a DVD here by a local filmmaker called John Warland, and he tells the rest of the story of what happened to Ursula's skeleton. And it's fascinating. And as they say, truth is stranger than fiction, and it really is. But that was my first book in the series, Strange Magic. Next slide, please. And then again, next slide, please. Sorry, I'm racing through them. But sorry, next slide, please, Chris. Yeah. Okay, so this is another book where I looked into another myth. This is the Witch Stone, which is in the grounds, the car park of the castle in Great Leys in Essex. And according to legend, under this lie the charred bones of Anne Hughes, who was known as the Witch of Scrap Faggot Green. Now, the legend is that she bewitched many people to death, and she was, of course, an old and evil witch, and so she was sent to trial. She was found guilty. She was hanged at the crossroads, and then this she was buried there, and then this stone was rolled over the top. The interesting thing about this is that in 1944, next slide please, the Americans came in and they decided that they were going to commandeer the pub, but they couldn't get their trucks through the car park because of the Witch Stone. So they decided to move it, whereupon all the locals said, don't move it, you can't, the witch is buried underneath there, she'll come back up. So they left it for a minute, but during that time, while they were leaving it, lots of strange things started to happen. There were hauntings, sights of a woman walking through the village, and apparently the sheep got out of the cow field and the cows got into the sheep field, which was crazy apparently, and people started saying we're being haunted. It got into the People. This is an article, and next slide please. In fact, in the end, they the village got hold of, this is Harry Price, who was a great, was sort of skeptic, ghost hunter and debunker. He looked into Borley Rectory, and he came down and had a look around the village. He was often debunking clairvoyance and mediums as well. So he did an investigation and he spoke to the Americans, and the American army asked him what his conclusion was, and he said, it's a poltergeist. So, which I find extraordinary, but that's what he said. And so the Americans withdrew and they put the stone back and they went to find somewhere else, and all the phenomena settled down. So I think I'm running out of time now, but next slide please. Next slide please. I'll make this my last one. So Strange Tombs, which is my last book, actually looks at an interesting incident that took place in Danbury in, sorry, I just had to put my glasses on to get the date for this, in 1779. And I was alerted to this by my son's headmaster, who told me this crazy story, and it took me ages to find it, but I did find an article in the Gentleman's magazine. And what happened was, if you could please go to the next slide, thank you, Chris. In the church, they were opening up a grave to bury an old woman who was a benefactor of the parish. Well, whilst they were digging down, they came across a stove, and it was just by an effigy of a Knights Templar, according to the magazine. They hit the stone, took the stone up. Beneath the stone, there was a lead coffin. So they managed to open this up. Within the lead coffin, there was an elm coffin. Within the elm coffin, there was a shell, which was apparently 3/4 of an inch thick. They managed to get through this shell and then were presented with an absolutely intact body of a crusader that was perfectly preserved. And also around him, there were lots of feathers and flowers and herbs, which allegedly were absolutely perfectly preserved, though this was centuries old. It's not known whether his legs were crossed, because an old man put a walking stick in them to test them, and one of the legs came off. But he was apparently a very hearty youth, and very beautiful, and absolutely, as I said, perfectly preserved. And there's a little note here as well, which says that the liquid that he was in tasted of ketchup and the pickle of Spanish olives. Anyway, next slide, please. So I went over to see Danbury Church, where this took place, and it is a really fascinating church. Next slide, please. And actually, next slide, please. Yeah, and these are the sort of the ends of the pews. So next slide, please. Yeah, you can see they're all quite gothic-y and crazy there. Next slide, please. And you can do the next slide as well. Thank you, Chris. Yeah, and also, so I was really fascinated as well by this story, which was by E. Nesbitt. It's a short story, and it's about stone effigies of crusaders who come to life at Halloween and wreak havoc on the local community. So basically, I sort of gathered up all of these elements into strange tombs and put a murder mystery in there, and the mystery of the crusader comes up too. And I think that's my time. So thank you.
Thank you very much for that fascinating talk. I can see there's already 3 questions in the Q&A. If there's any particular question that anybody in the audience would like to see answered, if you could please like that question, because we're going to, at the end, we're going to go through the questions in terms of how many people have liked the question, because there's already quite a lot of questions there. Syd's Essex Witch Museum books are classic mysteries. They're funny, they're full of great characters, and they're seeped with Essex folklore and history. So do check those out. I'm going to give the last talk now. I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, I don't know if that's worked. Ah, great. Okay, good. I hope you can see that. Okay, well, you can see that. Great. Okay, well, I do a lot of reading about the 19th century in order to get period details and story ideas for the Arrowood books, which are set in the 1890s. And this includes reading about the crimes of the day as well as the policing methods. Now, some of the things that I read about end up as part of the plot lines or the secondary incidents, but other material that I read about is useful as a backdrop to help me understand how people committed crimes in that century, how detectives tried to solve them, and also how criminals were punished. And today I'm going to tell you about 3 famous murder cases that happened in the 1800s. 2 of them have resonance today, which I'll explain, while the other I've chosen because it's got local interest here in the east of England. And it's that case that I'm going to start with. So I tried to move the slide on there, but it doesn't appear to. Okay, I hope you can see that. So I'm having a few technical issues here. Okay, good. I hope you've got that on your screen. Sorry, my screens have gone all crazy here. So yes, so I'm getting a thumbs up signal. Great. Okay, well, this is this Red Barn murder, which happened in 1827 in Polstead in Suffolk, where the 26-year-old Maria Martins, who was the daughter of a mole catcher, was killed. Now, her lover was the 22-year-old William Corder, who was the son of a farming family, and he had a reputation for being dishonest, having in his youth fraudulently sold his father's pigs, amongst other things. Now, earlier in 1827, Maria Martin had given birth to their baby, who had died only a few days after birth. William Corder told her that the local constable was going to prosecute her for having had an illegitimate child, and that they had to flee. He asked her to meet him at the Red Barn, which was a building on his farm, and from there to elope with him to Ipswich. Maria's stepmother Anne was present when this was arranged. Now, after leaving her house alone to meet him on the 18th of May, Maria Martin disappeared. Now, William Corder told her family that she was hiding in Ipswich and she was not going to come back because she was afraid of being prosecuted. And eventually he also left the area. He then sent letters to Martin's family claiming she was living with him on the Isle of Wight, but couldn't write or visit him for various health reasons. Now, the family became suspicious, and in 1828, Maria's stepmother Anne began to have dreams where she saw Maria being murdered and buried in the Red Barn. Now, in April of that year, Maria's father investigated and found Maria's body decomposed in a sack buried in a grain barn in the Red Barn. She'd been shot in the head and stabbed in the neck, face, and ribs. Corder was tracked down to Brentford, London, where he had married and was running a ladies' boarding house. And just to prove that Tinder is nothing new, he'd found his new wife through posting an advert in the Times, to which he'd had 100 applications. The police found the pistols that were bought on the day of the murder, as well as Maria's handbag in his house. Now, William Corder denied the murder, saying that Maria had taken the pistols and killed herself. And he also claimed the stab wounds were a result of the tools used to dig up her body from the grain bin. William Corder was convicted and executed in Bury St Edmunds in August 1828, and there was huge public interest in the case, mainly because of the stepmother's dreams. So between 7,000 and 20,000 people turned up to watch his execution. Now, at this time in England, and there's a link here with what Syd was telling you about the skeleton found, at this time hanged murderers were sometimes dissected in public after death. And this was based on the historical Christian belief that on Judgment Day, the resurrection of the dead would only happen to intact corpses. And this posthumous execution, as it was called, was thought to be a face worse than death. And the mutilated body was put on public display to show that a person can't escape justice even after execution. So Corder's body was taken to the courtroom, slit open down the abdomen and put on display. And that day, over 5,000 people filed past to view the body. William Corder's body was then dissected in the county hospital in front of medical students, and surgeons examining the skull and using the insights of the pseudoscience phrenology declared it was overdeveloped in the areas devoted to secretiveness and destructiveness. And this seems like confirmation bias in action. His skeleton was reassembled and kept in a glass case in the West Suffolk Hospital, where you see it there. And it was rigged up so that when people walked past, a spring attached to his arm made the hand rise and point at a charity box. Now, as was common at this time for executed murderers, a plaster cast of his head was taken. But as was less common, the county surgeon, George Creed, tanned Corder's skin and used it to bind a book that he'd written about the trial. Bits of tanned skin also made the rounds in Bury St Edmunds, where people were said to have licked it to see if it tasted like leather. And these, along with William Corder's black scalp with one ear still attached, are on display at Moyses Hall Museum in Bury St Edmunds, which has a section devoted to the murder, and it's well worth a visit if you happen to be in the area. Now, there is one final plot twist to this story. Rumours circulated that Maria's stepmother Anne had been having an affair with William Corder at the time of the murder, and that she was in on the plot to kill her. Her dreams also began in the days after Corder's wedding to his new wife in London, suggesting that jealousy might have been behind her revealing the location of the body. Okay, I'm going to tell you about the second murder now, and this happened in London in 1864. When Thomas Briggs's body was found by the train line outside Hagley Woods station. Police investigations revealed he'd been murdered in a train carriage, where a beaver hat was found on his seat. His family told police that it wasn't his hat and that he always wore a bowler hat. Now, at this time, bowler hats didn't look quite the way they look now. You can see as the picture on the right, the man on the right there, the crown of the hat was much taller in this day, and it was much more like the size of a top hat. This becomes relevant later on in this story. So the police eventually tracked down the killer, Franz Müller, in the United States. And he had in his possession Briggs's watch and bowler hat. However, because he was a shorter man, he had cut down the crown of the hat to fit him better by removing a segment around the hat band and repasting it, which resulted in a much shorter bowler hat, much more like the bowlers of the 20th century. This was also a very famous trial, and it was covered extensively in the newspapers. It was such a famous murder case that 50,000 people turned up to watch Muller's execution in November 1864. It fed the Victorian fascination for murder, with plays and stories published, ballads written, and souvenirs sold. And hat makers made the most of the huge public interest in the murder by designing new, shorter bowler hats, which they called Muller hats, and this was the origin of the bowler hat that we know nowadays. Now, this murder also spawned a slang term because the word mullered began to be used as a term for murdered. And gradually it's changed its meaning so that nowadays we use the term mullered to mean completely plastered, which makes you wonder where the term plastered came from. Okay, now the final murder was also a case from London. Most of us know the famous Victorian story of Sweeney Todd, the barber with a penchant for killing his customers in his barber's chair. And once dispatched, his friend Mrs. Lovett made meat pies out of them to sell in her pudding shop. Although some people claim this was a true story, there isn't a lot of evidence that Sweeney Todd ever existed. However, there's a similarly gruesome tale from London in 1879. Kate Webster had been in trouble with the law many times in her short life, and she was first imprisoned for age 15 for theft in Wexford. Then at 19, she got 4 years in Liverpool for several counts of theft, and at age 26, she got 18 months in London for 36 counts of theft. When she was 28, she was sentenced to another year for theft. Just after she was released from prison at the age of 30, she managed to get a job as a servant in Richmond with the widow, Mrs. Julia Thomas. Now, it seems that Mrs. Thomas was known for being a difficult employer, and she'd had a series of previous servants who left or were fired. At this time, 40% of working women were in domestic service, so even the wealthier working class families had one, and they were often called slaveys. Now, the relationship between the two women was difficult from the start. Julia Thomas was very critical of her work and watched over her constantly. Kate Webster had a liking for the pub, and within a month, Mrs. Thomas sacked her, demanding she leave the house within a few days. That Sunday, Julia Thomas went to church. When she returned, Kate Webster was waiting for her. She threw her down the stairs and then choked her to death. And then, according to her confession, I chopped the head from the body with the assistance of a razor, which I used to cut through the flesh afterwards. I also used the meat saw and the carving knife to cut through the body. I prepared the copper with water to boil the body to prevent identity. And as soon as I'd succeeded in cutting it up, I placed it in the copper and boiled it. I opened the stomach with a carving knife and burned up as much of the parts as I could. And these pictures are pictures of typical Victorian coppers, which were boiling vats for doing the laundry. And the one on the right actually coming from Jane Austen's house. Anyway, while it was boiling up, Juliet Webster went to the pub for a drink. Kate Webster. Now, this pub was called the Park Road Tavern and later called the Hole in the Wall. So the boiling removed the flesh from the bones, and the body parts, except for the head and foot, were wrapped in paper and packed into a hat box and a Gladstone bag which were thrown in the Thames, and these were found a day later along with the foot, which was found in a rubbish tip in Twickenham. The head was not located. Now, local legend has it that a few days later, Webster offered the landlady of the local pub 2 pots of best dripping, which was actually the lard rendered from Thomas's boiled fat. She's also said to have offered some local boys some food, saying, "Here you go, lads, I've got some good pig's lard which you can have for free." The boys ate 2 bowls of it. Now, Webster lived for 2 weeks in the house. She wore Mrs. Thomas's clothes, dealt with tradesmen as her dead mistress, and told neighbours that Mrs. Thomas was ill. She was discovered when she tried to sell the house, because the men who came to collect her furniture said to the neighbours they were working for Mrs. Thomas and pointed Kate Webster out. She was rumbled. She fled to Ireland but was arrested and brought back to London. And this was another very famous case in the newspapers. Crown Prince Gustav of Sweden came to watch her trial. And during the trial, Madame Tussauds created an effigy of her and put it on display. Numerous street ballads were composed, including one with the catchy title of "Murder and Mutilation of an Old Lady Near Barnes." Kate Webster was hung on July 29th, 1879 at Wandsworth Prison, the only woman ever to be hung there. After the execution, the copper was bought for 5 shillings, while the local publican bought the knife. Other enthusiasts visited the house and took twigs and stones from the garden as souvenirs. Now, there is one final twist in this story, in that Webster had buried the head in the stables of the pub and never revealed its location. It was found 131 years later in David Attenborough's garden. Because builders had dug it up as David had bought the site of the hole-in-the-wall pub to extend his garden. And that's where I'm going to end my talk. We are going to open this up now for questions. So I'll just open the question and answer chat. And as I said, we're going to go through the questions in terms of the number of likes they've had. Okay, so the first question that we've got then is, while researching, do you ever come across curses surrounding the artifacts, and do these worry you? Okay, Cathi or Syd, would you like to respond to that one?
Well, I don't think I've come across curses, although I think that some of the stories are a bit cursed, like Bad Penny Blues. The story of that was terribly hard to get a grip on. And there's various elements in Bad Penny Blues that connects over to everything all of you have been saying, like Harry Price is involved. But I think it's probably more likely that Syd might have come across a few witches' curses in her time.
Do you know what? I haven't. But I think that, you know, the second part of that question I find quite interesting. So if you did come across a curse, would it bother you? It totally wouldn't bother me at all, because I think you've got to remember that most of well, I'd say, you know, 99.9% of the people who were executed for witchcraft and who are now have their legends in their local towns as being witches weren't witches. You know, they were old women who were scapegoated and bullied, basically. So if they had power at all, then I'm sure they would have used it to get out of prison or get away from the gallows, but they didn't. They were victims. So, you know, and I think there's another question there about sort of how do you verify things, and I think, you know, I was talking about Anne Hughes, the Witch of Scrap Faggots Green. You know, and she's been buried under that witch's stone. Well, there's two things there. One is that when I went back to the original Aziz's trials, I found that she had been tried for murder by through witchcraft, but she'd been found not guilty and she'd been released. So A, don't know who was underneath that stone, if anybody was, and then B, this witch's stone itself, which is never meant to be moved because it will bring down a curse on the village. You know, the landlord took me aside and just said, we've moved it loads, but nobody's noticed.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Syd. The next question we've got is from Jane, who says, with so much misinformation about witchcraft, both historically and ongoing, what's the process like for the authors in sorting out truth from the more sensationalist news reporting that probably happened around these crimes?
Yeah, well, shall I do that one first?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Well, again, just sort of like what I said, really, I go back as much as I can to the records. So with Sarah Moore, who was the Sea Witch of Lee, you know, she is locally known to have been the cause of the great storm of the estuary of 1870, which, you know, lots of fishermen and lots of boatsmen, sailors lost their lives to it. When I went back to the records, I found that she died in 1867. So that was 3 years before. And of course, again, people conflate different things, and people, you know, Leigh-on-Sea fishing towns are generally very superstitious. And I think women and witches get blamed for a lot of things. So you've got to go back as much as you can to the documentation and look at what's going on there. That's my short answer.
Yeah. I think Syd, that basically if you want to destroy a woman, call her a witch or call her mad. And I think what both of us has tried to do is sort of look at women who have transgressed their usually working class backgrounds to get to some position of power, either be it through being a famous medium like Helen Duncan or the witches that you have written about, and how they've then been persecuted and how they've been treated by society in general. And we've both written about Matthew Hopkins and the damage that he caused. And yeah, I think it's just us trying to read history from the female's point of view and trying to sift, you know, their truth out of the lies that have been told about them, really, isn't it? That's what makes
us. And also, I think as well, because, you know, history is written by the winners. And when you're dealing with all of these women who were mostly peasant class, who were illiterate, and then who got killed and their reputation was completely tarnished, no one else is telling their side of the story. That's kind of where you can actually use your novelist's head, because you can find out as much as you can, but then you can imagine what happened to them, and you can reinterpret the accusations and think with a 21st century head about what happened there.
Yeah, because it is a class thing as well, very much so.
Yeah.
Great, thank you very much. The next question we've got is from Rachel, who asks, I'd love to hear Cathi and Syd's thoughts on the English witch trials, misogyny and religion, and their views on how they link together.
Right, okay, well, misogyny was the mainstream, really, then, I think. So, you know, and I think, yeah, it's I mean, there weren't just women who were hanged for witchcraft. There were men, but it was the majority were women, and of all ages. And you know, one of my work in progress at the moment, I'm looking at the three Jones who were all hanged, I think, 1589, and I'm looking at the daughter of one of the Jones, Avis Cooney, who was a naughty woman, apparently. So, and you know, think about that and what kind of moral inference that you can get from a woman being accused of witchcraft because she was naughty, and anyhow she was found guilty, and but she did something called pled the belly, which meant she said she was pregnant, so she got a reprieve, and she was allowed to have the baby, and then the day after she had the baby she was taken out and hanged. So yeah, misogyny was, I would say, was the mainstream at the time, and you've got to peel that back and, you know, not accept, what's that word about, kind of, I'm trying to think of it, the general acceptance, the general, help me out here.
Consensus, you mean? Yeah.
Yeah, there's something knowledge. Anyway, you know, this idea that the witches were evil, you've got to peel that back, and you've just got to look at the situations. And quite often, as Cathi said as well, it was classist. And, you know, a lot of the women who were killed were receiving money from the parish tithes and the poor rate. So if you did get rid of them, then those who were wealthier didn't have to worry about giving so much to the church. So there was a kind of economic aspect to it as well.
Yeah, it's also another thing I think it's so interesting is how the rest of the downtrodden population will love a witch hunt. And that's something that I explored in my book Weirdo, which was set in Great Yarmouth, and where Matthew Hopkins came through, and where I saw the horrible little dungeon where he tortured some of his victims in the Tollgate Museum, which you can still go to, well, after present restrictions are lifted, I'm sure. But I've recently read a book about the original Salem witch trials in America, and while I was reading it, was the storming of Capitol Hill was happening, and you just think people who are generally at the bottom of society will be happy to turn on the next person to deflect the attention away from themselves. And it's a really nasty instinct that we have, and the Salem witch trials are a complete madness that gripped that corner of the world at a time. And also, I think it was in one of your books, Syd, and I've noticed one of the questions at the side ask about how our witch hunts relate to the ones in America. And you posited the idea that Matthew Hopkins isn't, in fact, in his grave, didn't you? And he
yes, that's right. Yeah. that isn't actually that I picked that out of a book by another author called Richard Deacon, who I think you know, he has been criticised for some of his research, but I did try to have a look to see. I went up to the National Archives to see if I could find whether or not there were any ships that were going out between 1647 to, I think, 1650, and to see if Matthew Hopkins could have actually got on one of them and gone to Massachusetts, where his brother was, where Salem is in Essex County, and I found. So this is kind of an interesting thing as well. So what happened was I was really disappointed because I found that there was there'd been a flood in the records office, so there were no records at all for about 25 years. So I was like, oh no, I can't prove it. But then I was like, I'm a novelist. Great. This means he could have.
Because his grave is empty, isn't it, Syd? There's no one in Matthew Hopkins' grave. Is that right?
Well, we don't really know where it is. It's kind of like a sort of I was going to say urban legend, but a rural legend. It's meant to be it's meant to be a Mistley churchyard, and there is a kind of like sort of very weird patch of grass there. The local legend says is where he was. Where he was buried. It's barren, it's got nothing on it. But I think they're actually now developing that into a housing estate.
Oh, good luck anyone buying a luxury condo there then.
Yeah.
Great. Okay. Well, that is very interesting. All that. We've got more questions. What is the most disturbing? This is from Bella.
Bella.
Yeah.
Bella.
This is
Bella. What is the most disturbing thing you have found out? I'm just going to go quickly first of all, and then I'll hand over to you. The Fanny Adams case in the Victorian era, I think, is the most disturbing. And this was a girl, a young girl, who was murdered in Hampshire one day by a man, and her body was chopped up into lots of different pieces and scattered over 2 hop fields. and the whole village went out and searched her to find her when she went missing, and found out that she had been slaughtered in this way. It was a horrible, horrible case. But within a few years, that's disturbing enough. But what is even more disgusting is that several years later, sailors began this new sort of tinned stew was introduced into the Navy, and the sailors used to call it Fanny Adams, because it was this horrible mixture of bits and pieces of, they couldn't quite work out which body parts they'd come from. And the term, so that term became used to describe anything that was unpalatable and sort of sloppy. And then it became, the word became, Fanny Adams became, the name became used as Sweet Fanny Adams to mean nothing at all. You know, she knew Sweet Fanny Adams about it, that sort of example. And gradually that got merged with the other term, Sweet FA term. So nowadays, when people say Sweet FA, it's a sort of mixture between Sweet Fanny Adams and Sweet swear word all. But I mean, I found that really disgusting in the way that the disrespect that happened there in using her name in that way, for me was the most disgusting. So shall I hand over to Cathi?
Yeah, I remember reviewing a book for 40 Times that had that Fanny Adams case in, and it shocked me to the core how brutal that murder was. It was absolutely vile. Shock of the old, I called it. Oh my God. But yeah, the most disturbing thing that I researched, actually, it does relate kind of to what we've been saying about witches and women's power, and I don't think I'll ever write it now. I wanted to do 4 books set in the 1940s, and I wanted to link some true crime. All of them are based on true crime. One of them, which I might still do, was about the acid bath murderer, John George Hay, who would have been a good wife for that last lady that you talked about, Kate, who boiled her up in a copper because he had his own little acid bath, and they would have made a lovely couple, those two. But the other was the Messina gang, who trafficked women in from Europe into London and had wholesale prostitution rackets going. And I did do a lot of research into that, because it obviously does hold a mirror up to the current sort of trade in shipping women over for these purposes. And it's just far too depressing. I don't think I'll ever get a book out of that anyone would want to read, although, you know, it was illuminating to see, you know, exactly how the rackets worked in those days. So I don't think I'll be taking that one any further. What about you, Syd?
Well, I'm constantly shocked, really. One of the things, have you got me? Have I frozen?
No, you're there.
One of the things that I find kind of shocking is that although we look, you know, a lot of my research is into the past in Essex, all of these things are going on around the world as we speak in different countries. So we kind of like think of it as a historic thing, the witch hunt, but it's not. You know, it's absolutely epidemic in Papua New Guinea. It's going on in India. It's in Saudi Arabia. It's in loads of places. And also, again, with trafficking, we are having people trafficked for witchcraft purposes now. And I know in Sweden they've got a really huge problem with trafficked women who are bonded to their slave masters, and who go through a kind of weird juju witchcraft ritual to be bonded to them, and then will not leave them, will be trafficked and sold, and won't leave them because they think there's some kind of soul connection and they need to have something, this thing that they do, the oath, they need to have that back, otherwise their soul will be gone. So it doesn't matter about their body. But anyhow, you know, what is shocking is that it's still going on around the world today, and here in Britain as well.
Thank you, Syd. We're approaching the end, but we did say that we would go on for maybe 5 minutes extra if there were a lot of questions. So we'll just do a few more questions before we end, and probably end at about 20 past. To all authors, how do you conduct your research? Where do you start, etc.? So should we go to Cathi for that one?
Yeah, well, I think we probably all do it in a fairly similar way of looking in archives, going to museums, reading as broadly as you possibly can about a subject. And in my case, I also like to bring in the music of the times as much as I can, I guess, because I started off being a music journalist. So to recreate the past, I'm really interested in popular music and popular culture and fashion and everything that went on around, so that I can kind of recreate this world. And then after a while, it's like method writing. After a while, you suddenly feel like, I'm here, I'm in the room, I can tell the story. Is that something that you two both feel when do you reach a certain point when you're there?
Yeah, I definitely do. Yeah, I think research is really good for me anyway, to find the plot, because I don't start with a crime I want to write about. I try and find some social or political issue in the 1890s and try and work around that. So I need to know a certain amount about that issue. For example, I've got a book coming out in July which is based around a real case of 4 Zulus who were taken to a London's magistrate court to be prosecuted for refusing to perform in an ethnic exhibition in London, in the London Aquarium. And I read about that, and I followed, and this is another, I suppose, about the research, I followed their story in the newspapers through the incredible archive in the British Library, which has hundreds of British newspapers every single day, and I could follow their story in that. But that's just, when I knew about that story, and then I had to read a bit about Zulu history, and particularly what the situation of South Africans was in the 1890s in colonial South Africa, and how they tried to resist colonial rule. Once I knew a bit about that, then I felt I reached that moment, Cathi, where it felt okay to start writing something. What about you, Syd?
I just sort of follow the clues, really. Usually, I've got books in my head probably for another 6 or 7 books, so I kind of like, oh, that's interesting, I'm going to do that there. And I've just signed for a new 3-book deal, which is looking at, it's something I've referred to in the past, and actually, Cathi, you'll love this. We can get together about this. But it's looking at what the British Secret Service did with certain occult things in the Second World War, exploiting what they saw as the weakness in the chain of command in Nazi Germany. And I will be listening to the 40s records and tuning into the radio that does them and all the adverts. And I'm really looking forward to doing that.
Yeah, no, that would be brilliant, because the music's the best in that time, I think.
Yeah, and it's so crazy as well, the stuff that's coming up at the moment. So obviously it's a really good time to be looking at this, because the D notices are coming up, and you find out much more than people could about 20 years ago. Yeah,
that's brilliant. That'll be great.
That sounds fantastic. There's a great question from Charlie here. Do any of you authors identify as witches?
Maybe.
What did you say?
Maybe.
Yeah, I think definitely other people identify me as a witch. Definitely, I've been called witch many times. I don't actually practice magic at all, but I definitely am, I think, witchy in terms of the fact that I'm too loud, too mouthy, completely undomesticated, and people would go, she's a witch, get rid of her.
Beautiful and clever and funny, Syd, how dare you. And beautiful and clever and funny, how dare you.
Checks in the post.
So both of you are sort of dodging the question, I feel here.
Are we talking Wicca? Is that what we're getting at here? So
the question doesn't specify, but
okay. I have flirted with paganism in my 20s, which was interesting, and I'm very into the natural world. But I'm kind of like, for me, I'm a bit with religion. I'm a bit like Groucho Marx was.
Yeah.
Okay.
Are you a witch, Mick?
Well, I didn't feel I needed to answer that question because I don't write about witches, and I don't know if I would be permitted to be. Sorry? Can
you answer it?
Yeah, I know. Right. We've got it. There's just one really quick question which I quite like, because we can answer this really quickly because we've come to the end. This is Sue. Do you need special permission to write about these cases?
Maybe only from a higher authority, but not from anyone on the earthly plane.
Okay. Syd?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's 100 years, isn't it? I think it's 100 years or something for to write, that has to pass before you write about someone. Can't remember actually, but no, I haven't sought permission to write about anything. It's too long ago, I think, for me.
Yeah, okay. And I've never sought special permission either. Now, I'm so sorry, there are so many fascinating questions there, but we have actually got to end now. Many thanks to all the people who have come to listen to this. We can't see you, unfortunately, but we know you're there. We sense your presence. Thank you very much for being here, and thank you so much to Cathi and to Syd for being brilliant guests, fascinating things that we've been hearing about. And we've got a great people behind the scenes, Miriam running the festival, and we've got Chris on the tech, and Alice as well. So thank you to everybody, and thank you for coming. I hope you've enjoyed it.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.